55 years ago, a man named Earl Cutter walked out of a feed store in Haskell, Texas, climbed into his pickup truck and drove home. He had been inside for maybe 12 minutes. And in those 12 minutes, on the unpaved lot behind the building, something happened to a woman named Dora Jean Pryor that Earl Cutter saw with his own eyes through a gap in the slat fence and told no one about for 30 years. Not his wife, not his pastor, not the sheriff's deputy who knocked on his door 3 days after Dora Jean's body was found in the scrubland east of town and asked if Earl had seen anything unusual that afternoon. No, he said, nothing unusual. He was 41 years old when he said it. He was 71 years old when he finally said something different. On a Tuesday evening in 1999, in a room at the Haskell County Sheriff's Office, his hat in his hands, his voice so quiet the detective had to ask him twice to speak up. He sat in that room for 3 hours and answered every question put to him without flinching. When it was over, he said only, "I should have done this a long time ago." Then he went home. That is not a story about a man who forgot. That is a story about a man who knew exactly what he had seen, understood exactly what it meant, and spent 30 years building up the courage, or the need, to say it out loud. And what it took to bring that confession from a Tuesday evening in 1999 to a conviction in 2001 was a detective who had been carrying Dora Jean Pryor's name in his memory since before he even joined law enforcement. A prosecutor who understood that a single eyewitness account, uncorroborated, aging, was the most fragile kind of evidence in the world, and a family that had kept a candle in the window for 3 decades without ever knowing whether anyone would come. But before we can understand any of that, we have to go back to Haskell. We have to go back to 1969. Because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Dora Jean Pryor was. Haskell, Texas in 1969 was the kind of town that measured itself in churches and cotton fields. Population just under 4,000, county seat of Haskell County, set out on the rolling mesquite plains of northwest Texas, where the summers came hard and long, and the winters came without warning, and everyone in between was simply working. There were 3 grocery stores, a movie theater that showed pictures on Friday and Saturday nights, a grain elevator visible from almost anywhere in town, and a cafe on Avenue D called Vera's, where the coffee was strong and the pie was whatever Vera felt like making that morning. Dora Jean Pryor was 28 years old, and she had lived in Haskell her entire life. She worked 5 days a week as a bookkeeper for a farm supply company on the north side of town, a job she had held since she was 22, and she was, by every account given in the months after her death, the person in that office who kept everything organized and on time. Her employer, a man named Grover Ennis, told investigators she was the best bookkeeper he'd ever had, and that he had given her 2 raises in 6 years without her ever asking for one. She knew the accounts better than he did, he said. He wasn't embarrassed to say so. She was the second of 4 children raised by her parents, Thomas and Bernice Pryor, in a wood-frame house on the west side of town. She had a younger brother named Calvin who idolized her. She had a habit of keeping a small notebook in her purse where she wrote down things she wanted to remember, recipes she heard about, books people mentioned, a line from the radio that struck her as worth keeping. The notebook was green, the size of her palm, and her mother had given it to her for her 21st birthday with a note inside that said, "For all the things worth writing down." She had filled 4 of them by 1969 and was most of the way through a 5th. She sang in the choir at First Baptist. She had a laugh that people remembered. She was, in the quiet daily ways that don't make headlines, someone whose presence in a room made the room better, and the people who knew her knew that specifically, and held on to it in the years after she was gone. She was not married. She had been engaged briefly at 25 to a young man who had subsequently moved to Abilene for work, and the engagement had dissolved without bitterness. She lived alone in a small apartment 2 blocks from her parents, close enough to walk over for Sunday dinner, which she did every week without fail. Her mother set a place for her as a matter of course. Her father always had the radio on when she arrived. On the afternoon of Tuesday, September 9, 1969, Dora Jean left the farm supply office at 4:30 and drove toward the feed store on the south end of town to pick up a bag of seed corn for her father, who had a small garden he kept behind the house and had asked her to stop in when she had a chance. She parked on the street in front. She went inside. She was in there no more than 10 minutes. She was last seen alive walking back out through the front door toward her car at approximately 4:50 in the afternoon. That was the last time anyone admitted to seeing her. Dora Jean's car, a pale blue 1965 Chevrolet Biscayne, was found the following morning, still parked on the street in front of the feed store. Undisturbed, her purse was on the front seat. The green notebook was inside it. The bag of seed corn she had bought was in the trunk, which was unlocked. Her keys were never recovered. Her parents reported her missing that same morning, when she failed to arrive for breakfast. Thomas Pryor, a man who was not given to alarm, told the deputy at the Haskell County Sheriff's Office that his daughter had not missed a morning without calling ahead in 6 years, and that something was wrong. The deputy took the report. 3 days later, on September 14th, a rancher named Otis Gilbreth found Dora Jean Pryor's body in a dry wash east of town, on county land that bordered the back of several properties along Farm Road 600. She had been strangled. Investigators determined she had died within hours of leaving the feed store. There was no evidence of robbery. Her purse had been left with the car. There were no signs of struggle inside the vehicle. Whatever had happened somewhere between the front door of the feed store and the driver's side door of the Biscayne, which sat no more than 30 feet apart. The lead investigator was Chief Deputy Walt Selman, 44 years old, 18 years with the Haskell County Sheriff's Office. He was a methodical man who kept careful notes and had a particular discomfort with open questions. This case would give him more open questions than he knew what to do with. He canvassed the block. He interviewed everyone who had been in or near the feed store that afternoon. The owner, a man named Pete Garfield, said Dora Jean had come in, paid for the seed corn, and left. He hadn't watched her go to her car. He'd had another customer at the counter. The other customer, a farmer from the north part of the county, confirmed the same. He'd seen her at the register, but hadn't looked up when she left. A woman who ran a beauty parlor 2 doors down said she thought she'd heard a car door close around 5 o'clock, but hadn't thought anything of it. Nobody had seen anything useful. Earl Cutter's name was on Walt Selman's canvas list. He had been in the feed store that afternoon. Pete Garfield confirmed it. Walt knocked on Earl's door on September 17th. Earl said he hadn't seen anything. Walt wrote it down and moved on. He looked at 2 men over the following months. The first was a seasonal worker who had been in Haskell the week of Dora Jean's death and had a prior arrest for assault in Lubbock County. He had left Texas entirely by the time Walt reached him. He was in Oklahoma, working a grain harvest, with a crew of 6 men who vouched for his whereabouts on the night of September 9th. Eliminated, the second was a man from the south part of the county, whom 2 people independently described as having an unpleasant history with women. A vague and unchargeable characterization that nonetheless sent Walt to his door 3 times. The man had a firm alibi for the evening. His wife confirmed it. His neighbor confirmed it. There was nothing left to pull on. The case went inactive by June of 1970. Dora Jean Pryor's green notebook sat in the Haskell County evidence room for 22 years before the building was renovated, and non-essential items from closed cases were transferred to storage. It was still there, in a labeled bag in a filing box, when a young deputy named Ray Ochoa was assigned to the cold case unit in 1992 and pulled the box from the shelf for the first time. Walt Selman had retired in 1979. He died of a heart attack in 1984. He had never stopped thinking about Dora Jean Pryor, and the people who knew him said he had never made peace with that case the way he had eventually made peace with the others. By 1980, Thomas and Bernice Pryor had both aged into a grief that had become simply the texture of daily life. Not acute, not consuming, but always present, the way a piece of furniture worn to the specific shape of you becomes invisible until the day it isn't there. They kept Dora Jean's photograph on the mantel. They still drove past the feed store without ever stopping there again. Bernice kept the green notebook that had been returned to her after the case went cold. She kept it in her nightstand drawer and never opened it, but she knew it was there. Calvin Pryor, Dora Jean's younger brother, who had been 18 when she died, spent most of his adult life in Haskell, working a farm equipment dealership he'd taken over from a retiring uncle. He was quiet about the case, in the way that people from small towns learn to be quiet about things that haven't been resolved. But he never let the anniversary of September 9th pass without spending some time at Dora Jean's grave. Every year, in all weather. He brought no flowers. He just stood there for a while, sometimes talking, sometimes not, and then went back to his truck and drove home. By 1992, when Ray Ochoa pulled the case file from storage, Calvin Pryor was 41 years old. His parents were both still living, fragile now, slower. His father had taken to sitting on the porch in the afternoons, and sometimes Calvin would come by and sit with him, and they would talk about anything except Dora Jean, which was its own way of talking about her. Ray Ochoa was 29 years old, newly assigned to the cold case unit at the Haskell County Sheriff's Office, and he had grown up hearing about Dora Jean Pryor, the way you hear about certain things in a small town, peripherally, imprecisely, as a shape of absence in the community's memory. His mother had known her. Not closely, but enough to remember the laugh. Enough that when Ray pulled the case file and read Walt Selman's meticulous notes for the first time, it did not feel like history. It felt like something unfinished. He went back through Walt's canvas list. He re-interviewed the people he could find. He drove out to see Pete Garfield, who was still alive, still sharp at 78, still running the feed store his son now managed. Pete told him everything he'd told Walt, word for word, and then said, "You talked to Earl Cutter?" He was in here that day. Ray checked Walt's notes. He had. Earl had said nothing. Ray went to find Earl Cutter. Earl had sold his farm in 1983 and moved into town. He was living in a small house on the east side of Haskell, 64 years old by then, widowed since 1988. He invited Ray in without apparent anxiety and answered his questions with the same even steadiness he had offered Walt Selman in 1969. He had seen nothing. He was sorry he couldn't be more help. Ray wrote it down and went back to the office. But something kept him at it. He reread Walt's notes. He visited the feed store and walked the lot behind the building. He stood at the gap in the slat fence. The fence was new now, vinyl. But it stood in the same place the old one had, and looked at the angle it provided to the street where Dora Jean's car had been parked. It was a direct sightline. If you were standing at that fence in 1969, you could see the car. You could see anyone standing at the car. He didn't go back to Earl Cutter. Not yet. Some part of what he understood about small towns told him that going back too soon would close a door he might need open. He kept the file on his desk and returned to it between other assignments, year by year, building a picture he couldn't yet prove, and waiting for the moment he didn't know was coming. Every case like this one represents months of patient, painstaking work, cross-referencing old files, finding the people time has almost buried, refusing to let the calendar decide what still matters. If you want us to keep bringing these stories forward, take a second to like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get back to Dora Jean. On a Tuesday evening in February 1999, Ray Ochoa's phone rang at home. It was Earl Cutter. He said he had been thinking. He said he would like to come in and talk, if that was still something that could happen. Ray said yes, tonight, come now. And Earl said he would be there in 30 minutes. He was there in 25. What Earl Cutter told Ray Ochoa that evening was this. On the afternoon of September 9th, 1969, he had been standing at the gap in the slat fence behind Pete Garfield's feed store, loading a bag of mineral supplement into the bed of his truck, when he heard a car door and looked up. He saw Dora Jean Pryor walk out of the feed store's back lot toward the street. He saw a man step out from beside a parked truck and speak to her. He saw her stop. He saw the conversation last no more than a minute. He saw the man take hold of her arm. He saw her try to pull away. He saw the man open the door of his truck. He saw Dora Jean get in. Not willingly, Earl was clear about this. Had been clear about it inside his own memory for 30 years, not willingly. She had been pushed. The truck drove south on the street and turned east on a county road. Earl had known the man. He had known him the way everyone in Haskell knew everyone, not intimately, but enough to put a name to a face. The man's name was Harlan Brock. He was a farmer from the southeast part of the county. He was also, in 1969, a man whose family had been in Haskell for 3 generations, whose uncle sat on the county commission, and whose standing in the community was, to use Earl's word, considerable. Earl had gone home that evening and told himself it might be nothing. Then Dora Jean's body was found. Then the deputy knocked on his door and asked if he'd seen anything. And Earl had looked at that deputy and thought about Harlan Brock's family and thought about what it would mean to say yes and had said no. He had said no every day for 30 years, and then, at 71, with his wife 4 years gone and his health beginning to turn, and a deputy who had been patient enough to stay with a case that most people had forgotten, Earl Cutter had decided that 30 years was long enough. Ray Ochoa worked carefully. He knew what he had was a single eyewitness account, decades old, given by a man who had previously lied to investigators. In court, a defense attorney would dismantle it methodically. He needed to corroborate it at every possible point. Harlan Brock was 73 years old, still farming the family land in the southeast part of the county. Ray began building the case around him quietly. He confirmed through motor vehicle records that Brock had owned a truck matching Earl's description in 1969. He located 2 people who had seen Brock's truck on Farm Road 600 east of town, the road that led toward the dry wash where Dora Jean's body had been found, on the afternoon of September 9th. One of them, a woman who had been 16 at the time and was now 46, had always remembered the truck because it nearly ran her bicycle off the road. She had never been asked about it. No one had ever asked her. Biological evidence from 1969 was minimal, but a reanalysis of material preserved from the original autopsy, a fiber recovered from Dora Jean's clothing, was consistent with upholstery fabric common to late 1960s Ford truck interiors. Not definitive, but consistent. Harlan Brock was arrested in the spring of 2000. His attorney moved immediately to challenge the eyewitness testimony. The trial lasted 8 days. Earl Cutter took the stand and told what he had seen, and when the defense attorney asked him why he had waited 30 years, Earl paused for a long moment and then said, "Because I was afraid. And then I wasn't afraid anymore." Harlan Brock was convicted of the murder of Dora Jean Pryor in September 2000. He died in prison in 2007. Calvin Pryor was 69 years old on the day of the verdict. He had driven himself to the Haskell County Courthouse alone, the way he did most things. He sat in the third row. When the foreman read the verdict, Calvin did not react visibly. He sat for a moment, then gathered his hat from his knee, stood up, and walked outside into the September heat. The same month, 31 years later. He stood on the courthouse steps and looked out at the town his sister had grown up in. And later, talking to a reporter from the Haskell Free Press, he said, "She deserved better than 31 years, but she deserved this too." Both things are true. Calvin took Dora Jean's green notebook from his mother's nightstand. Bernice had died in 1996, still not knowing, and had it restored by a bookbinder in Abilene who reinforced the spine and cleaned the pages without disturbing a single word. He keeps it now in a glass case in the living room of his house on the west side of Haskell, in a room that gets afternoon light. He has read it once. He says once was enough to know everything in it. Dora Jean Pryor was 28 years old. She kept a green notebook filled with recipes and remembered lines and things worth writing down. She sang in the choir. She made Sunday dinner at her parents' house every week without fail. She had a laugh people carried with them for decades without being asked to. She was going to have more of her life than she got, and the only reason she didn't is that a man with considerable standing made a decision, and a second man with ordinary fear decided not to say what he had seen. Both decisions cost her everything. Earl Cutter lived until 2004. He attended Dora Jean's gravesite once after the conviction and left nothing but the fact of his presence there. Ray Ochoa spoke at Earl's funeral, which surprised people. He said Earl Cutter had been a flawed man who had finally done a hard thing, and that in this world, sometimes that is the most that can be asked of anyone. That is a complicated kind of justice. It is the only kind this case was ever going to produce. And after 55 years, it is the kind that Dora Jean Pryor finally has. Justice found Dora Jean Pryor 31 years after she was killed. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe that the names of the forgotten deserve to be carried forward, subscribe. More cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here. What do you think? Does Earl Cutter's 30-year silence make him morally responsible for what happened to Dora Jean? Or does his eventual testimony redeem that? What single detail in this case stands out to you as the most significant failure? The original investigation, or the community silence that surrounded it? And what does it say about small-town justice that the same social weight that kept a witness quiet for 30 years was also the reason it took this long? Leave your thoughts in the comments.